Well, we want to now do our official opening remarks and get on to the first session. Torture is a very old topic. We'll hear about the ancient Roman experience of torture tomorrow, but I want to just start with a quote from Seneca's Consolation to Marcia that reminds us of how old this topic is. "Over there I see torture devices not of a single design, but constructed in different ways by different people. Some men have hung their victims upside down. Others have driven a stake through the genitals. Others have wrenched the arms with a fork-shaped yoke. I see racks, I see whippings, and each joint and limb has its own custom-made torture machine." And that was in the 1st century AD. Unfortunately, it's also a very new topic, as you've already heard from the student papers talking about everything from private contractors to the practices at Guantanamo. We'll hear much more about those examples soon. So we set out to explore this topic and to do it in an interdisciplinary way. And let me just give you a little bit of background on how the conference came about. We have every year a law philosophy workshop, the function of which is to take themes that are explored both by law people and philosophy people and to see what mutual illumination comes from considering those themes together. And so we've done this for about 8 years now, had a variety of themes. But then last year, our Dean Lovemore, to whom we owe great gratitude for this whole event, created a new program, the Law Philosophy Postdoctoral Fellowship Program, which brings every year now a fellow to the law school for a single year who would then very likely choose the theme for the workshop and in connection with that organize a conference that would be a way of developing further the theme of the workshop. So Scott Anderson is our first law philosophy fellow, and he is a PhD from our own philosophy department who, while he was a graduate student, took a lot of law courses and wrote a dissertation on coercion in which he discussed legal issues as well as philosophical issues. So he was a natural choice for that inaugural fellowship. And so he's done everything for this conference. I've done nothing at all, and it really is his invention to try to take the philosophical and legal themes of the workshop in the direction of these issues of great contemporary importance. The other important decision that Scott made and that we all support is making it an interdisciplinary conference. Our law school is lucky that we're on the same campus and the same calendar with other units in the university, and there's no other place where interdisciplinary cooperation flourishes the way it does here. You can see that in the student papers themselves, which came from so many different units. And the commitment to interdisciplinarity, both in the famous law and economics programs, but now more recently with the development of additional programs in law and philosophy, is a real hallmark of our law school. We also decided to make students central to the conference, and I think you can see already what a great decision that was. So I think at this point I'm just going to turn it over to Scott, but I'd like to ask you also to give a vote of thanks to Scott for everything that he did.
Thank you very much, Martha, for the very kind remarks and for the orientation to what we're doing here. Just to follow up, I wanted to mention I put out on the table a couple of things that came in particular, one document that was sent by, I believe, Mary Ellen O'Connell, who is at Notre Dame, who couldn't be here, that is a statement by military interrogators saying why they should not use torture. I mentioned that both for its own sake, but also just to mention how this topic tends to bring people who don't necessarily all get together and don't have a chance to talk to one another together because of how important this is and because people want to pitch in to do what they can to say interesting, useful, and hopefully things that will make torture less prevalent than it has been recently. The first thing I want to say about putting this conference together was that it is extremely easy to do this sort of thing when you are at a school like the University of Chicago, which is devoted to making things like this happen. So as opposed to, say, being in a philosophy department where I am normally, this was a snap. But that's mostly because of people like Dean Lovemore, who has been very generous in offering law school support and very kind in facilitating my being here. But also to the staff, and I want to thank especially Karen Afshari, who is in charge of the organization for the law school as far as I understand it, Lucianne Goodman, who has done some of the work organizing food and logistics, Marcia Furziger-Nagorski, who's done the publicity, Ted Ressel, who does some of the IT work and the AV, Aaron Rester, who has done the website and some of the AV work for us, and especially our secretary for the workshop, Lori Weirs, who's done yeoman service trying to make sure everything worked the way we needed it to. I also want to thank briefly the chairs who have devoted their time to this. That's Adam Samaha from the previous session, the next session Susan Bandes, Robert Gooding-Williams, Andy Koppelman, Susan Zesch, and Richard McAdams. And of course I want to thank all the speakers who've come from near and far to make this an interesting and enlightening event. I want to, besides the law school's own support, I also want to thank the Center for Comparative Constitutionalism, who's helped made it possible to bring our keynote speaker here today, Albie Sachs. Just a few logistical notes. As you notice, we are taping these sessions. We assume that you're okay with that. If you speak up, that you will be on that tape. It will be eventually posted to the law school website so that these proceedings will not be limited to those who are here today, but that others may see them in the future. The washrooms, for those of you who haven't had occasion to visit them yet, are at the end of the hall and towards the left or downstairs, either direction. Please, when we get to questions and answers, keep your questions succinct and to the point. We have not been able to, because we have so many great people here, we don't have enough time to give all questions their due, but certainly want to keep them as brief as you can. There will be chances to talk to all of the speakers at various receptions and breaks, especially after the keynote address tonight. There will be a reception that you're all welcome to attend. And there is a table right outside here that as things go on, we have a few books there already, but many of our presenters here over the conference have written books on these subjects, and they will be putting books out there for you to examine. They are not for sale. We're not having book signings here, but it is a chance to get a sense as to what kind of work is out there by our presenters. So with that, I will bring up the next panel, Susan Bandes and Bill Gorman and Nancy Sherman, talking about the psychology of torture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott, and I'm really thrilled to be included in this very important conference. I am going to introduce, first of all, our two speakers. And please come on up, make yourselves at home. This is Bill Gorman, who is wears a number of hats, but probably the most relevant one to the current topic is that he is a longtime board member and volunteer at the Marjorie Kovler Center for the Treatment of Survivors of Torture, and he's going to be talking about therapeutic challenges with victims of torture. And secondly, we will hear from Nancy Sherman, who's a professor of philosophy at Georgetown University, who will be talking about Stoic equanimity in the face of torture. The title of the panel is Psychology and Torture. My job as moderator, unfortunately, includes a rather coercive element, which is that since we do have such a rich agenda today, I have asked the panelists to speak only for half an hour each, so that after each panel presentation, we have 10 minutes for interchange, and I'm going to try to be a little bit strict about that. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Bill Gorman.
Okay, thank you. I'm very happy to be here, honored to be included in this. The topic that I suggested was therapeutic challenges, working with victims of torture from a therapeutic point of view. The challenge also will be to try to work within half an hour's time. I'll try to, in my comments, provide kind of a human face to some of these issues that, from a psychology point of view, I found most compelling. I recognize that this conference is largely political, philosophical, and legal, in its emphasis. I hope the psychological side of it can add to it as well. I begin with a couple of general speculations about psychology's part in this with regard to torture. I think that psychology is both part of the problem and part of the response, if you will. The history of it in terms of the problem has been traced in some of the literature back to at least the 50s, when there's a film, a documentary came out, won the Academy Award, Taxi to the Dark Side. It profiles D.O. Hebb at McGill University in his research on sensory deprivation in the 50s. And it has kind of a shocking statement by him saying that the advantage of sensory deprivation is, in effect, it shows no bruises, but it breaks the person. He predicted that within 2 to 3 days of total sensory deprivation, the personality could be destroyed. That was some hyperbole, kind of a misplaced enthusiasm, if you will, but it was used by the Defense Department, and it continues to be used now. That's the way psychology has contributed to some of the intents of torture. In the 60s, another set of studies were using the pharmaceuticals, psychopharmacology, LSD, in terms of trying to break the brain, if you will, as a method of controlling people that you wanted to break. Milgram studies are famous, maybe the most famous studies in psychology about obedience. There had been kind of a wish to think that what happened in Nazi Germany was because of the German character. Milgram studied wholesome all-American college students and found out that they would inflict torture just under orders to do so without question over and over again to the point of inducing pain. This changed the way human nature in some ways was understood, certainly the way the power of obedience was. And I think it is bearing now in terms of understanding what happens with torture. Then even more maybe compelling, I think, was Philip Zimbardo's research, which he tried also in the 60s and 70s, called the Stanford experiment, where he divided normal college students up arbitrarily into either prisoners or guards in a totally contrived situation. What he found within a matter of days was sadism and victimization running amok. He had to interrupt the experiment. He couldn't let it run a week because the college students that were playing the guards became, as Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. They were into torture. They were into abuse, and the victims were being broken by it on both sides. He couldn't, in good ethics, continue it. He's written several books on this since then. So those are some of the antecedents that led to this. On the other side, psychology and other mental health professions have responded to try to address the effects of torture. I'd briefly like to try to review some of that. That it began after World War II with the UN Declaration for Human Rights and the Covenants, looking at what happened in the Holocaust and also veterans who had been traumatized. That was some of the general concerns. More specifically focusing on torture, it came into focus in Chile in '72 when Pinochet overthrew Salvador Allende, and there was widespread persecution. And the mental health community in Chile was sophisticated enough to respond and try to focus on what do you have to do to help people recover from torture. This spread to Argentina, to Central America, and to many, many other countries. In the 70s, there was an influx of refugees coming from Southeast Asia, and both on the East Coast and the West Coast, Oregon and in Massachusetts, there were efforts to address their traumatization. In the 80s, in Copenhagen, the first center for victims of torture was started in Copenhagen. Then in Toronto, in '83, another one in Minneapolis, the first one in the U.S., and in '87, in Chicago, coming out of a University of Chicago conference that was held, and out of that came the Cloveler Center, which has been working for 20 years, which is the background that I bring to this. Currently, there's 200 centers worldwide working with torture. There's a great deal of knowledge that's been gained from this, both in terms of the effects of torture and the treatment of it. I'll briefly speak to more of the effects of it for the purpose of this, putting, again, I hope, some human face on what it means to be a victim of torture. The torture that's understood is described as having a triple paradigm. particularly for refugees. There's the torture itself, obviously, and then there's the uprooting, the no longer fitting in, and the loss of what one had. Those three different aspects of it. The violence of the uprooting, particularly if you become a refugee and have to leave your country. But even if you return to the community, you don't fit into it the same way. You're different. You are marginalized way too much. So as terrible as the torture is, what follows from that compounds it greatly. Another important aspect psychologically is that the torture is mitigated or exacerbated by earlier life experience. You find that what a person had gone through previously plays a huge part in how they are able to endure or recover from the torture. That is, if they had a healthy background, we see amazing capacity for people to be able to get on with their lives in spite of things that I would think would have left me totally broken. On the other hand, if they had a difficult background, it's going to be greatly compounded. The cultural factors play an equally important part as early life experience does. The short-term immediate effects of torture, besides the physical ones, which most quickly come to mind, are the psychological, which are less visible. The cognitive ones, disruptions of memory, disruptions of concentration, the problems of ruminations, being obsessive about what one went through and not being able to stop thinking about it. This happens with all trauma. It can happen even more, I think, with people from torture. The emotional ones are the ones you would expect: depression, anxiety, anger, confusion. Learned helplessness is one of the immediate consequences, and humiliation. It comes from having extreme and arbitrary stress imposed without the ability either to fight it or to flee from it. You're trapped in it. This is what can induce in animals extreme anxiety conditions. It's the same thing with human beings. It's one of the psychological effects of torture in the immediate sense. The third area is the social: a loss of trust, a loss of sense of identity, a loss of community. I'd mentioned marginalization as well. And then, if we had the time, it'd be important to talk much more about the existential, the spiritual sense, the bereavement that takes place as well. It leaves a person feeling vulnerable, attempting to cope as best they can, often with ways that aren't real adaptive, such as using alcohol, using numbing. In the longer term, the most obvious effect of torture and all trauma is PTSD, which has been diagnosed for about 20 years now in our professions. There's three parts to it: tendency to avoid any situations that are reminders, withdraw socially, hyperarousal, hypersensitivity, nightmares, intrusive memories, flashbacks, and then the numbing, having no feeling, shutting down because it's too difficult to cope. Another area besides PTSD and separate from it is substance abuse, self-medicating, affect and mood dysregulation, not being able to control one's feelings, being submerged and overwhelmed by grief, by shame. The isolation and denial is huge. Trying to avoid thinking about it, trying to avoid acknowledging that it happened, trying to get on because you can't face it, that we often find. Survivor guilt, you can perhaps appreciate the significance of it. The sense of shame often happens, even though the person who was victimized should have no reason for shame. They often carry that as well. And even worse, a self-blame. They feel somehow it was my fault that this was done to me. They blame themselves. They can work their way through that, but the blame is an important effect of this experience. Depersonalization, a sense of I no longer feel like I'm myself. Things no longer feel real. Sexual dysfunction, somatic problems we often find with psychological origins, that is fatigue, headaches, stomach aches that have no organic basis for it, but it's a manifestation of the underlying emotion that can't be expressed otherwise. Despair, depression, I hope would understand well how that would come to pass. Impaired work, impaired relationships, even more seriously, psychotic syndromes can take place. And then we don't find this often, but the literature shows it: abusive and antisocial acting out. That is, the victims themselves internalize the aggressor. They will show domestic violence, violence in other situations as well. In 20 years working at the Colville Center, I've seen that maybe 2-3 times, so it's not a common manifestation what we've seen working with refugees there. On the other hand, what I want to speak to is not just the negative side of it, but the positive side of it. There was an article about 2 years ago, came out of Columbia University by George Bonanos on resilience, and it was really paradigm shifting, at least for me, saying that if we look for trauma, that if we look for symptoms, that's what we're going to find. And he looked at two conditions, both grieving or bereavement and trauma, and he said that maybe we've overdiagnosed, that when we see people with incredible suffering, we tend to look for the symptoms and we find what we look for. He argued instead that if you look, you'll also see resilience, that people can go through these experiences and come out of them, perhaps even in some ways the stronger for it, not certainly easily or always, but it does happen. And in our experience at Kovler, over and over again, we see people struggling with huge, huge degrees of suffering and show incredible resilience. It leaves us in awe. And I know it maybe sound a little emotional or corny, but it is really why this work is not depressing to do, because you see the capacity to survival and the capacity to mobilize their resources and to get on with their lives in ways that we wouldn't have predicted. We'll finish up, if I can, with kind of a snapshot to illustrate how this plays out. But I'll briefly sketch what goes into the treatment. This isn't a therapeutic conference, so I won't go into detail on it. But Judith Herman has talked out of Harvard about 25 years ago on trauma and recovery, and she identified 3 broad stages: conditions of safety, conditions for reconstruction, that is re-experiencing the trauma in a way that allows it to be incorporated, to be integrated, to be, if you will, psychologically digested, rather than put apart where it festers and where it interferes with functioning. It basically means the narrative, retelling the story under conditions of safety where it can be re-experienced in a way that allows coming to terms with it in a better way. I'm speaking a little metaphorically, but these are very accurate ways of describing the healing process. It's very slow, but moving from safety to reconstruction is what we generally find to be the case. Then the third stage is reconnection. Reconnection with one's sense of past, even more importantly, reconnecting with a sense of the future, a sense of hope, reconnecting with one's own identity, reconnecting with the world around one, no longer feeling withdrawal, reconnecting with your feeling and with your internal experience. That under the torture, the victim shuts down from it. Under the recovery, they're able to move after the safety and the reconstruction and into the reconnection and become more fully functioning again. That's been our experience, and that's the theory that we find. I'll run through this very quickly. We want to save a little time for questions. But let me tell...
You're fine.
Okay, good. I may be able to stretch out a little then. Let me tell one story which I think kind of expresses some of this. Because I think the psychological torture is the preferred way to torture people rather than the physical. The physical is more brutal, but it's also more seen. And it also, they find that it's not even very effective in getting information, that under the physical torture, people will say anything to stop it. They try to use the psychological torture to break their will to resist. It's called, one book on it calls it the breaking of the mind and the body, to shatter the person so that their own sense of efficacy is no longer in play. The psychological means are used more often. That is sensory deprivation, humiliation, the shaming, the guilt, the violation of one's own values, the use of the Quran, for example, smearing faces with menstrual blood. These don't leave bruises on the body, but they can certainly leave bruises on the psyche, if you will. So the psychological are considered the soft, the lighter torture, but in some ways they're the more powerful and the more profound, and they have more lasting effects, as I'll try to illustrate. The other speculation, with a little time, 45 seconds, why psychological torture is used is, and this is just my opinion. I think that the experts, it's already been referred to how the FBI, maybe the paper that was mentioned that is available here, The people who do interrogation say torture doesn't work. They say getting trust, getting alliance works a lot better. The FBI says that. Experts in the CIA say it. So the question is, why is torture used? Why is the abuse used? And I think it's used in ways that Zimbardo's study in Stanford Prison says, because when you have power over somebody, you can become perverted by it. And after 9/11, I think this country had a need for revenge and a need to avenge itself. And psychologically, even if we could get information that we needed by alliance and by the engagement with the detainee, the effort was instead to punish them, to show our strength by asserting ourselves over other people. So I think we come back to some maybe irrational ways, but from a psychological point of view, makes some sense to me. Okay, I have two thoughts. Let me tell the story because it shows how the effects of torture sometimes are not seen. We work a lot with lawyers, which perhaps is relevant here, and often lawyers don't understand some of the ways that victims of torture show the consequences. That is, they show no feeling. They can be detached from it, and that can suggest that maybe the victim isn't telling the truth. From a psychological point of view, when we work with the lawyers or when we go to the immigration court and argue for asylum, we try to say that the very lack of emotion, the lack of affect in telling their story is one of the signs of how they're trying to cope with it. It's hallmark of PTSD. There was one guy that I worked with for 5 years, and during these 5 years, we went through a lot of changes together. In the beginning, he was here by himself from the country where he had escaped. He had been a labor organizer there, and several in his family had been killed. He was imprisoned. He was tortured for about 2 months. Often the telling of the torture is so idiosyncratic, and one of the things that was outstanding for him was hearing a staccato thudding sound over and over again at night. He didn't know if it was a basketball being bounced or if it was guns being fired, but he said it was terrifying to him and it continued to haunt him. These were the kind of things. He had insomnia, he had nightmares, he couldn't relate to other people. He was doing really menial work. He'd left his wife and 2 very, very young children back in his home country. For the first year or so, he came every week, and I really wanted to work with him therapeutically, and I found it very difficult to do so because I could never get beyond the surface. We were always just on the very concrete, very immediate, the weather, the traffic, his job, but nothing regarding the past, nothing regarding what was going on inside him, as much as I would try to probe for that or move in that direction. After about a year and a half, he brought his wife over with the children. There were 1 and 3 years old, and he brought them to the meetings. And he went way out of his way to come to these meetings. We met in Uptown, and he worked as a gardener up in the North Shore area in a pickup truck. He would go up there, and he lived in Pilsen, so you can maybe sense the geography for those of you from Chicago. Anyway, it would take him about 15 to 20 miles from the time he got off work to go home and get his family to come and meet with us, with me, and the interpreter I was working with. And we met for every week for, as I said, over the course of 5 years. And each meeting would be about an hour and a half, so we'd finish up about 9 o'clock at night. And it was obviously really important to him to do this, but I was really puzzled as to what the value of it was. And I would try to ask him about it because it never seemed to be going anywhere. And I was concerned about whether I was working with him as effectively as I could. And I would say to him, how is this helping? And he said, I don't know, it just makes me feel better, which was good enough to continue on. And he'd bring the kids in, and so the kids would play, and we would talk about the kids. And the kids got older, and they were 2 and 4, 3 and 5, and they were really a nice part of the meeting. And his wife was very quiet in the meetings, but he wanted his family there. Anyway, after 5 years of working with him, I got a call on a Saturday morning from him. He spoke very little English, but he called me at home and asked me if I would come to his wedding that day because his marriage was a common law one, and in order to give his wife more security being in this country, he wanted her to be legally his wife. I wasn't able to do it that day because I was busy, and I was a little surprised by it too. And I told him I couldn't make it, but then he said to me, well, what about the party tomorrow? The party's at my house. And I wasn't busy for that, and so I went to that. But in a therapeutic frame, especially I was on the state's ethics committee, and so some of these extracurricular roles can have consequences and affect treatment. And with the cross-cultural aspect here, I really wasn't sure what would happen. So I went to the party, and everyone there was, every time I tell this, I stumble on this part, but everybody there was short and dark, and I was tall and white, and so I really felt like I was out of place. And everybody there was speaking another language, and the only people that I could relate to were the kids that I knew, and they were very cool. And so I stayed there about half an hour, 40 minutes. I'm not real good in those situations anyway. I left, and I felt a great sense of relief when I left, and I didn't think much of it. That was on Sunday that I went to that. 3 days later, we met, as we had been doing for 5 years, on Wednesday. On Wednesday, then, sitting there, he started to rub his legs, and he had talked before about the factory job he had as being difficult on him because he was on his feet all day long and it was cold in the factory and his legs bothered him. So when he rubbed his legs, I said to him, "Are your legs bothering you?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Is it from the job?" And he said, "No." He said it's from the torture, which he'd never said before. He'd never introduced this topic. The interpreter, who was very skilled in this work as well, she and I looked at each other, and so I said, "From the torture." And then he went into it, and he said, "Yes, when my legs hurt," he says, "I remember everybody who died there. I don't feel I have any right to be alive." And he said that it brings it all back to me again. And he said, "And I don't know what to do with this." He said, I feel like I have no purpose. And I saw him as really being a good father and a good husband. And so I turned to his wife, partly because I was a little trying to get some time here to think how things had taken this turn. So I turned to his wife and I said, do you think he's right that he has no reason to be alive? Because I thought she'd easily be able to say he's such a good father and a provider and a good husband. But before she was able to answer, he raised his hand and he said, "Don't ask her, because she has never heard me talk about this." He said, "I've never told anyone about this." And then and his kids, who were really lively, had stopped moving and playing, and they were kind of standing there looking at him. He put his hand on his son's head, and his son was named after his brother, who was a priest who'd been killed. And he said, "And when my son grows up," he says, "I want him to know about his brother who gave his life." And my point in telling you this is it was really moving. It was extremely unexpected, and it was a profound breakthrough for him. And it happened, as you can tell in the story, because I'd gone to the wedding. You know, I wish I could tell you that was my intention. It wasn't. It was pure luck. But what came out of it was, after 5 years working with this man, somehow conditions of safety were moved up a little bit. With that being in place, he was able to access some of his experience. He was able to articulate. He was able to deal with it. Over the next 8 months or so, things changed a lot. He was able to sleep a lot better. He said his depression lifted. He felt more freed up from some of the memories than he had been before. Treatment doesn't always work that well, and this was kind of an exceptional one and a very powerful one in my experience. My point in telling it here, though, is it shows how invisible the effects are of torture. This guy had everything going for him in terms of living in this country, conditions of safety, really nice children. He was earning a living. He had a good wife. He couldn't at all talk about what he'd gone through for 5 years, only because circumstances, almost by happenstance, allowed this to happen. Was he able to bring this forward? So that, I hope, puts more of a human face on some of these themes. The last thing, real quickly, that I would just say, and I look at the topic, I would be remiss if I didn't say that psychology in the last 2 years has been in great turmoil as a profession that I'm ashamed to say, frankly. That psychology as a profession, the American Psychological Association has refused to come out against psychologists participating in illegal detentions. The way psychiatry has, the way nursing has, the way the American Medical Association, the Bar Association, they've all taken stands saying that participation in interrogations is wrong and their members shouldn't do it. Psychology, on the other hand, the APA, has refused to take that stand. They're saying that psychologists being present can mitigate the effects, that they can help to prevent harm. A lot of us don't buy that. We think it's being done for other reasons, that there's tremendous organizational advantage to being affiliated with the Defense Department. That's certainly not acknowledged, and that's my opinion as one factor on it. But by the day and by the week, this is roiling the Psychology Association. Even the American Anthropological Association took a stand prohibiting its members from being involved in these kinds of efforts. And many, many people are resigning from the APA because of this, and it's very much an unsettled matter. I wanted to add that part as well. We'll be available for questions afterward. I appreciate your
why don't we
attention.
do that now, if you don't mind?
Okay, sure.
Would you like to sit?
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll actually take the prerogative and ask the first question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You talk in your précis about the secondary victimization that one might think would occur to somebody that's doing what you're doing for so long, and you suggest that there's so much hope and admiration that you gain that this, I think you say, actually outweighs it. But I wonder if you would talk to us a little bit more about how you do deal with that sort of pain on such a long-term basis.
Yeah, that's another topic I've presented programs on. I run a supervision group on Tuesday nights. It goes from 7 to about 9:30 for about 7 of the providers. And one of the reasons for it is to handle the reactions that happen on our side in doing this kind of work. The dangers are twofold. On one side, it's detachment. You work in the face of these terrible experiences, and you stop engaging in it because it's just too costly for you. For me personally, what was harder was when I was working with an AIDS group and all the men in it died during the 90s, and I just felt really much worse than I expected. I felt really defeated by it. It wasn't very rational. But in the work with torture, I find it not being quite as demanding on me as a therapist, because I see so much ability to get through this. But I really feel it's very important not to do this by oneself. And that's why we meet as a group and talk about it, and talk about the experiences that we struggle with as well. I just had one guy that I worked with for about 3 years that discontinued treatment, and he did it after I was gone for a month. And it's driving me crazy because I don't know why he discontinued, and it's difficult for me to handle my reactions. And yet, in talking about it with the group, they're suggesting that give him some time, and you don't. I don't want to go into the details on it, but I'm using it as an example of how the group helps me to be able to handle it better. I'm supposed to be the supervisor of it, but we're all in this together, and we all need to talk it through and sort out which are our reactions and which are theirs. The opposite side of detachment is enmeshment, where we take it too much home with us, and that can also happen, where you begin to feel depressed yourself. You begin to feel a sense of despair. How can this happen in the world? How can somebody see their mother raped in front of them, and hear that firsthand, or talk about a knife being pulled through their hands? It can be visceral in terms of you have to go into an empathic stance, and you have to remain objective too. Sullivan talked about the participant observer, and you have to have both parts of it, 1 foot in and 1 foot out. I briefly summarize that, but it's a struggle. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I guess I'll call you.
Nancy has a question.
Oh,
Hi, I have a quick question. I was just wondering if you could say that very quickly what kind of therapy you use. There's in the military world, there's a preference for CBT, a version of cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
Others would argue for a more dynamic approach or the like. So, just
Yeah.
quickly.
My day job is at University of Illinois Chicago, and we're more dynamic and interpersonal there. The CBT is more problem solving. I think the best therapy, though, that is evidence-based comes from Edna Foa, who uses the emotional re-experiencing, which goes back to what Judith Herman said. It's not CBT, but it is reconstructing the story under conditions of safety, and being able to do that, going through the experience again in a way that's lived and can be handled, is what we see as the outcome. I think CBT falls short of the need for this, and maybe dynamic does as well. It's not so much based on early childhood experience, but the relationship is key. The relationship is where the safety begins to emerge, as maybe was illustrated in that story where I went to the guy's wedding and then he could talk about it because of what was happening between us. Again, that wasn't my plan, but you learn as you go.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Martha.
I wanted to ask you about the role of anger in the therapy. I mean, one might think that an antidote to the shame and humiliation and the destruction of the personality would be to get the person to be angry at the people who did it to them and say that this just wasn't right, I have a right to be treated with dignity and so on. And also for you as therapists, the anger might prevent a certain kind of depression and disintegration from setting in. I just wondered what you think about that.
Yeah, the anger often I find is greater on our side as the therapist. It's like other trauma. When a woman is raped or when a child is abused, they find their first stance often is to blame themselves for it, and they don't reach a point of anger. Even when a woman has been raped, she can say, somehow I feel dirty, somehow I shouldn't have put myself in this situation, somehow it was my fault, and sometimes society colludes with that too. The same thing with victims of torture. They blame themselves for it, that I shouldn't have done it this way or I should have done it that way. It's partly an effort to regain a sense of control, that if I think that I could have done it differently, then maybe there's a way for me to prevent this happening. I can regain a sense that I'm in charge of my life. But it doesn't make room for anger around it. I think our anger is much greater, and we want to have the person angry, and sometimes we will gently try to express that there's room for outrage here. But we have to go with where they're at. And many of them find a certain fatalism or a religious kind of coming to terms with this that moves them in another direction than anger. But there's others that anger has to be worked through. Forgiveness can be a huge issue too that follows from the anger, but certainly the anger has to be dealt with.
This gentleman and then this guy.
You talked about one kind of torture victim, but if you look at the statement that was issued about 3 weeks ago by the National Council of Catholic Bishops, they were very clear in saying that these torture incidents always produce two kinds of victims: the one who's subjected to the torture and the torturer as well. And it strikes me that that's an aspect of this problem that doesn't seem to get discussed as much. I mean, we have the case of Eric Fair, who wrote that column in the Washington Post in which he talked about withdrawal, destruction of family. He says, as he sleeps at night, the victim is always with him. And then we have Elisa Peterson, who committed suicide. You want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I had that in my notes. Some of what's coming out of the studies now in Iraq of veterans, which I think has some bearing on this, is finding that there is greater PTSD in some instances in the perpetrators of trauma than in the victims of trauma. Certainly not always the case, but some people have a greater difficulty getting over the experience that they perpetrated rather than what they were on the receiving end of. And the Taxi to the Dark Side showed a number of the military that were over there.
The lack of volition in it is a key issue. I mean, it's not that it was their choice to do it. They were instructed. These are the techniques you are to apply.
Yeah, that too. Yeah, and the system certainly does not back them up. They're hung out to dry where the higher level remain sacrosanct. Yeah.
Hi, Claudia Card. And I was at a torture conference at Fullerton, California a year ago at which there were two survivors, a man and a woman. The woman counseled torturers, former torturers. The man did street theater. One of the things he told us was that, and he was from South America, many people who are the hands-on torturers are themselves survivors of torture, and that's how they learned how to do it. Have you encountered that in your work?
We have chosen at the Culver Center not to address the people who do the torture.
Even if they're survivors also?
The trouble would be that if they are people who have been torturers and they are coming to Culver, that can create conditions that are less safe for the survivors. And unfortunately, there's so much need that people who have approached there and said, I have done torture and I am troubled by it and I need treatment for it, are referred elsewhere. They don't receive services. But another example that I think is parallel is that people who experience child abuse are much, much more likely to be abusers themselves. So the idea of what was done to you is what you turn around and do often happens in these areas, I think.
Well, one reason I was different from this traumatic bonding thing was that survivors of torture often have a hard time fitting into society, as you pointed out, and finding other work. They end up doing this for a lack of a better alternative, some of them.
You mean becoming torturers?
Yes.
Yeah, right. And it's also a way of trying to gain some sense of efficacy again, of acting out. It's a terrible way and a destructive way, but I think there's a psychological understanding of that.
Time for, I'm afraid, only one more question at this point.
I don't know if it would be your field, but I wouldn't see why not, though. In terms of accessing people, is there ever any use of massage?
Yeah, the same thing as the street theater. So many things I wish I had more time for, but the talk therapy that we use in middle-class American ways really is not what the best approach for people who come from other cultures who have no understanding of psychology, no understanding of therapy, and the idea of using a much broader base. We use massage therapy a lot. We use dance therapy. We use music therapy. We use art. It's Cambodian widows created a tapestry which was tremendously therapeutic for them. The idea that you have to talk this all through is not what I meant to convey. A much broader base. Spiritual healing is really important, using pastoral work as well, and dealing with the legal situation. A lot of what we do, a lot of what I've done over the 20 years that's felt the most meaningful has been case management, helping them get a job, helping them get furniture, helping them get food stamps. Those kind of tangible things create, again, these conditions of safety in the relationship that allow more healing to take place.
Well, we will have more time a little bit later, but thank you so much.
Sure.
And I'd like to reintroduce Nancy Sherman. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, Martha. As Scott and Martha and I'm between two papers, and hearing that one, I wanted to give the one I chose not to give, but it's available for discussion in my brief 10 minutes. That is, I'm working on a larger book about the military, and I do have chapters both on interrogation from the interrogator's point of view and what they endure, and interrogation from the victim's point of view. And I've chosen to do the latter, but it was almost a flip of a coin this morning. So they're both here. I couldn't figure out a way to get them both in 30 minutes. I want to say, too, though, that I've been the part of the way this book is proceeding is that I've been interviewing a lot of soldiers at Walter Reed, as well as healthcare providers, and I have been to Guantanamo to assess the role of the American Psychological and the American Psychiatric, as well as the AMA, in their medical care for detainees, as well as their professional accountability for what they do and their division of labor. And you're right, the military often likes to think of the American Psychological and they themselves as the guys that can do forensics without Hippocratic oath as part of their mission. So I'm happy to talk about that as well. And then just one last thing, I do see at Walter Reed a lot of the invisible wounds, as they call them, the unseen wounds, as well as a lot of the alternative health care. There are very, very active programs at Walter Reed, which I take it as a flagship for this sort of thing. Also, it was a mess for a long period of time this year. But in doing massage therapy, meditation therapy, and there are protocols at work right now in the military on meditation therapy as stress reducers, pre-inoculators, they like to call them, as well as after the fact. So happy to talk about that. But right now I want to look a little bit at the victim and again look at literature as well as some folks I've interviewed. I begin with Waiting for the Barbarians by Coetzee. I have trouble saying his name. The torturer deals with my soul every day. He folds the flesh aside and exposes my soul to the light. He's probably seen many souls in the course of his working life, but the care of souls seems to have left him no more mark on him than the care of hearts leaves on the surgeon. So even if interrogational torture doesn't leave marks on the souls of the torturers, most always it leaves marks on the victims. And think again of Giacomo Timmerman, an Argentine Jew, editor and publisher of the newspaper La Opinion, until his arrest in April 1977 by an extremist faction of the Argentine army. He was held captive for 30 months, tortured and interrogated inside the army's clandestine prisons, and he offers advice for those who may face torture. Memory is the chief enemy of the solitary tortured man. Nothing is more dangerous at such moments. But I managed to develop certain passivity-inducing devices for withstanding torture in those long hours in the solitary cell. I refused to remember anything that bore on life experience. I was a professional stoic dedicated to this task. As Timmerman fashions it, professional stoicism is a mechanism of withdrawal. his words, that helped him avoid lapsing into that other mechanism of tortured solitary prisoners, namely rapport building with the jailer or torture. And by the way, when I was at Gitmo, the then commander of the detention center, who had replaced General Miller, said that our preferred method is rapport building, not harsh fear up or pride down. It allowed him to cast aside all logical emotions and sensations. Fear, hatred, vengeance for any emotion or sensation meant wasting useless energy. More recently, a colleague of mine last year from the Woodrow Wilson Center, where I was on a fellowship in Washington, Hala Esfandiari, and the director of the Mideast program, described in an interview I had with her a similar approach she took to enduring 3 months of solitary imprisonment at the notorious Evin prison in Iran in 2007. She was visiting her 97-year-old mother. She herself is 60. Then she was 67 and holds Iranian and American citizenship. She was detained on political charges of fomenting a velvet revolution through her work at the Wilson Center. During her months of captivity, she said she kept her sanity in part by trying not to think, quote, of my husband, my daughter, and my grandchildren. That would lead me to despair. She said once a week she was served an Iranian dish of lentils and rice. It is her young granddaughter's favorite, one she often makes for them, and the memories were so painful that she refused dinner those nights, once a week. What she did allow herself were the memories of her grandmother, and in fact she wrote a near complete biography in her head of her grandmother. She comes from a fairly well-to-do family, a political family, and she said to dwell on those memories of someone whose absence had been resolved would neither raise hopes nor cause despair. So Timmerman and Esfandiari's remarks point to a specific topic I want to explore, namely Stoic equanimity in the face of harsh detention and torture. How plausible is a kind of Stoic armor as a protection against the deprivation of military or political incarceration? And I take this up as something of a follow-up to a book I wrote a while back called Stoic Warriors, where soldiers, I take it through my experience in teaching at the Naval Academy, really are taught to be stoic in the face of battle and its aftermath. They're taught to suck it up, to get on with it, to endure stoically as they inflict lethal force and witness its consequences. And they're taught to survive POW status as in a kind of stoic retreat to the most untouchable core of self. So I want to think how far can they push that stoicism? One question that will be before us is this: in what way does a Stoic sensibility protect against a fundamental vulnerability that torture aims to lay bare? Namely, that the victim will ultimately use her will against herself in acts of self-betrayal and collusion. And David Sussman, who I think we'll be talking later on this afternoon, raises this in a very important article these past few years. How, if at all, can Stoicism protect a victim against the kind of collusion in one's own exploitation and degradation? And I have interviewed interrogators, and I take it the most valuable thing they can do is to get a victim or a detainee, a source, to trust them, to build the rapport, and then to collude, in a sense, in its exploitation. Timmerman alludes to a popularized 20th century version of Stoicism as a kind of splitting from painful aspects of reality that would sap one of mental energy or weaken control. Not surprisingly, the military has examples of this that are drawn more directly from ancient sources, and so another 20th century victim of torture, James Stockdale, turned directly to the 2nd century Epictetus, and on a prescient moment on September 9th, 1965, Stockdale, then a young naval aviator, muttered to himself as he was shot down by the North Vietnamese, 5 years down there at least, I'm leaving behind the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. In fact, it would be 7.5 years. He had been given Epictetus's Enchiridion, the handbook, as a parting gift from a philosophy professor at Stanford, and he thought he didn't have much use for it, but he actually committed it to memory, and it became the backbone of his leadership style in Vietnam in the Hanoi Hilton. So what are some of the lessons Stoicism might offer in controlling the emotions? Those in captivity who turn to Stoic consolations do so in part as a way of regulating unwanted emotions. What they wish to be free of is paralyzing fear, debilitating despair, the press of attachments and loves that are brutal reminders of loss and absence. To think about family, as Timmerman and Esfandiari say, is a cause of despair. Stockdale once told me in an interview that to long for a cigarette or a tasty meal and to be grateful when he got it was to make himself vulnerable to exploitation by his famous guard, Cat Eye. Better to not want those things, better to detach and fortify one's will against clamoring of need and longing. Now I'll try to be brief here with some background. The ancient Stoics view ordinary desires and satisfactions and emotional attachments to goods such as loved ones, honor, health, and fortune as disturbances or bads from which the healthy psyche should detach. To want and need and long for, whether in detention or not, is a vulnerability that destabilizes virtue and ultimately happiness. Virtue and the genuine happiness that constitutes it is a kind of rational self-control, indifferent to the vicissitudes of fortune. The view is regarded as extreme and unwelcome by some ancient contemporaries, Cicero in particular. He says, people come eagerly expecting to hear why pain is not an evil. The Stoics tell them that pain is a tough, unpleasant burden, contrary to nature and hard to bear, but not an evil because it involves no wrongdoing, no dishonesty or vice, no blameworthiness or cause for shame. Now, the Stoics will reply that you can, in fact, learn to detach from ordinary pleasures and pains, and you can learn to regard the despair of psychological or physical pain as not a real evil, and as something that will not really undermine your happiness. You can learn a special kind of indifference. Doesn't mean that you'll be apathetic, it just means that you will disprefer the things to which you might be attached. Now, indeed, any Stoic sage would prefer a life off the rack than a life on it, but he won't desire them in a certain way that will unbalance or destabilize his happiness. And indeed, they say if the latter of the sage's bad fortunes, they ought not derail his virtue or his well-being. For, and here's the key, they're external conditions, not things he does, but that are things that are done to him. And so, as Cicero puts it, no wrongdoing, no dishonesty or vice, no blameworthiness or cause for shame. So they don't implicate the will. One doesn't do wrong when one suffers it at others' hands. But what I want to explore is just that thesis. In conditions of detention, does one really remain invulnerable to others' wrongdoing? In what sense does one rather become complicit, collude, weaken one's will? In what sense might one believe one's corrupted one's integrity and feel polluted, degraded, or a sense of profound shame? Now, I want to get to that, but for the moment, two kinds of ways the Stoics think that you can gain some control over your emotions. One is they suggest that you could learn to distinguish between involuntary starts and startles and more full-fledged emotions, which involve appraisals to which you give voluntary assent. So if you're going to become more like a sage, you want to be able to block the full fruition of an emotion, block it from, nip it in the bud, you might say. And Seneca is an important source on this. Another is Gellius. But I want to look at one that's underappreciated, I think, but that's fascinating, and that's the Jewish Hellenist Philo-Judaeus of Alexandria. And he paints the same bright stripe between what just happens to one emotionally and what one indulges with one's will. And he says, in the course of allegorizing Abraham as a sage, he says, if he's really a sage, then how can he in Genesis grieve and weep over the death of Sarah? And he says, well, in point of fact, he doesn't. For a careful textual reading will reveal, quote, that the virtuous man did not resort to wailing or mourning, but only came there for some such thing. He only kind of got to the edge, you might say. And then he says, whereas things that unexpectedly and against his will strike the cowardly man and weaken and crush and overthrow him, they merely bow down the man of constancy in such a way as not to bring their work to completion. In short, Abraham, as Stoic sage, is never overcome by emotions, They're repelled by reason before they ever get to full fruition. Now, we might draw the line, put it this way, whether we draw the lines as the Stoics do and call these kinds of preludes, emotional preludes, as Seneca does, or as full emotions or not, the Stoic point is that they are phenomena that look just like emotions, but that unlike full-fledged ones are not voluntary and can be shaken off quickly. We might object on both counts. We might argue that proper emotions themselves, and not just physiological flashes or startles, often seem to have an element of the involuntary. Moreover, it's unlikely that even resolute subjects can easily regain control after experiencing prolonged or violent versions of these jolts. Torture seems to be a lab for just that kind of experiment. Indeed, one would expect that there's a substantive difference between prolonged or harsh exposure to what psychologists call traumatic stressors and more titrated exposures in relatively controlled or simulated conditions, such as the training schools that soldiers, especially special ops forces, go through, notably Fort Bragg Sears, Survive, Evade, Resist, and Escape School. It's not hard to imagine that even the most resilient Stoic sage would suffer degraded capacities for resistance after chronic exposure to the tools of terror in non-pretend cases where the victim knows that he's in true enemy hands. And I mention that because many folks that have been through special ops will say, I've been waterboarded and it's not really torture. That's not at the hands of the enemy, and it's in very titrated and controlled conditions. Seneca is helpful here. Although he's always eager to dismiss all sorts of fears idle and suggests that enough rehearsal of them will inoculate, he nevertheless concedes that torture, and in particular its visuals, the spectacle, the paraphernalia, the violence of the stronger, are effective methods for engendering dread, even in those practiced to resist. So he says, picture to yourself, just excuse me for a minute. Picture to yourself under this head the prison, the cross, the rack, the hook, the stake, which they drive straight through a man until it protrudes from his throat, much like the quote Martha read earlier. Think of human limbs torn apart by chariots driven in opposite directions, of the terrible shirt smeared and interwoven with inflammable materials, and of all the other contrivances devised by cruelty. It's not surprising, then, if our greatest terror is of such a fate, for it comes in many shapes, and its paraphernalia are terrifying. Other troubles are not less serious. They are, however, secret. So the remarks are in part a reminder to fellow countrymen of the cruel contrivances to which Rome and Romans have become accustomed to, the sport entertainment of the Colosseum and so on. But even more prescient are Seneca's observations about why the spectacle of torture can, as he says, coerce and master the mind. They overwhelm the capacity for coping. And the implication is that the human sensory and reactive capacities can absorb only so much before shutting down. And this is indeed the point of the work that you cite, Bill, by Judy Herman in Trauma and Recovery. Certain threats and encounters with violence are traumatic, she says, quote, because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. This, I think, is what Seneca is pointing to. Now, Seneca has in mind torture that's not interrogational. I presume it's torture for spectacle, punishment, or sadistic need, and maybe torture that's motivated by the need for extracting intelligence, putatively so, since most do reject that it's an effective method. The victim may believe, correctly or not, that he has some control in stopping the torture. But the main point to understand here and underscore is Seneca's concession that some impressions of dread lead not only to jolts and shocks, but to full-blooded terror in most of us. Now, so there's this idea of nipping an emotion in the bud, catching the aura, and then squelching it. But the Stoics have another method that's implicit in their work, and that is they suggest that there are some really transformative or transformed kinds of emotions, sanitized emotions, the good emotions that you would look to a sage for guidance in having. And these are equable emotions, calm emotions, you might say. And And specifically, the sage will have gotten over moral distress and moral upset because he's no longer emotionally vulnerable to being wronged, however brutally or humiliatingly. So in place of fear will be rational caution or wariness. In place of appetite, a kind of rational desire. In place of pleasure, a kind of equanimity and fulfillment. And again, made concrete here by Philo, Sarah, he says, a centenarian like Abraham, learns that God's opened up her womb. She laughs. How can she be a sage who laughs, who kind of loses her emotional control? Well, says Philo, she's in the grip of divine laughter. It's a kind of divine contentment, a divine pleasure. The joy will take that of the high priest. So it's a kind of godly laughter. Now, we might find these exegetical redescriptions contrived, and for many readers, both ancient and modern, they raise red flags about verbal gameplay. Still, the overall Stoic aspiration has its pull and may be reminiscent of some Buddhist-like goals that we find attractive, that we can become more self-sufficient, live with greater tranquility and inner quietude without fully disengaging emotionally from the ebb and flow of human transaction. We just engage in a different way. And so perhaps a take-home lesson for torture is this. Whereas an ordinary torture victim may be acutely frightened by physical threats or abuse, an emotionally enlightened one will be wary that these are precisely conditions ripe for exploitation and subsequent shame, and that very wariness is a form of strength, a signal to steel oneself against temptation, to become more wily, more cunning, more resourceful, to summon up control and some modicum of agency. But I think this over-idealizes even a sage, or at least it over-idealizes a sage who's meant to serve as a moral ideal for humans. Won't the sage who's incarcerated in abject conditions or interrogated harshly feel some anger, some despair, some shame at being degraded, humiliated, or treated as a mere shtuka? That was Primo Levi's view of how he felt he was treated, or in the chapter that I didn't read to you, one of my interrogators I interviewed talks about using people as a tissue and then throwing it away after he's got the information after it. More to the point, morally, don't we want exemplars who know feelings of shame and manifest them as a sign of our humanity? Morally, ought we not think these emotions have a place? Now, significantly, how am I doing in time?
You're, you have till 2:50. So
Okay, so I got it.
10. You have 10.
Okay, so significantly, the sages don't leave a place for emotions of distress, emotions of moral injury. For the only kind of legitimate moral distress on the Stoic view would be a reaction to one's own voluntary wrongdoing or the misuse of reason, and that's constitutionally impossible. And he's in control, a sage is in control of his virtue, and also, and this is the point I want to emphasize, in control of what can touch it, or what he can feel when something touches it, more to the point. And so Philo makes this point again. He says, if Abraham aspires to be a real sage, then like God, as Philo pictures a divine being, he won't feel suffering of evil inflicted on him. For the human race is subject to sorrow and to exceeding fear. And men are either grieved at unexpected evils pressing upon them, but the nature of God is free from grief. And so this comes up. Abraham, in sacrificing Isaac, is not supposed to feel real grief. He doesn't feel the trauma of what he's being asked to do. The sage then is godlike. Philo's God is the sage on high. His character and moral psyche are vulnerable only to what one does and what others do to him, or to those, or to what others do to him or those in his keeping. But again, I think this makes the picture far too remote and far too useless for guiding our own behavior. And I want to scoot forward a wee bit and call attention to something I recall very vividly Stockdale saying, this was just after 9/11 when I interviewed him. He said, He recalls saying to a fellow prisoner, the Hanoi Hilton, who had just come back from taking the ropes, "There are no virgins here." He told this fellow POW who felt tremendous shame for having broken when he took the ropes. Now, I want to be a little clear here what the specifics of this ordeal is, because they're not well known. So to take the ropes in the Hanoi Hilton would be the following, according to Stockdale. Quote, "They would start by clanging a big heavy iron bar down, then tie your feet to it so that you couldn't lift it. Then they'd sit you up, jackknife you over, and tighten the ropes around your arms. Next, they'd put you through extortions to the point that they would be pulling the rope so hard that the blood circulation in the upper chest would shut off. At this point, the guard would then dig his heels into the back of your head and push your nose into the cement. With panic and claustrophobia setting in, the prisoners could be made to blurt out information, some of which would be false, but other bits of which would be true. The confession was typically followed by a cold soak, which means 6 or 8 weeks of total isolation to contemplate one's crimes." In context, Stockdale's comment, "There are no virgins here," seems more than just comfort. He seems to be saying to his fellow POW that feeling shame is a morally appropriate response. It's a decent response to being coerced to do what he finds ignominious. And so I take it here, Stoic, himself a Stoic practitioner, and very, very moved by his reading of Epictetus. He views it as his salvation, what kept him alive in his 7.5 years. He sees Stoicism's limits. And I just want to mention here the shame that I'm referring to here is an assessment of self-appraisal. It's a self assessment. It's a judgment I make about myself. And the point of recognizing that torture victims may feel shame, the point I think you were saying, is not that they ought to feel shame for breaking, but that they do. And that is a very, very real feeling and a real sense of moral injury that they have allowed themselves to engage in. I'm going to skip a part about the depersonalization some find as a kind of protection, and how Stoicism might allow for a reading of that sort by minimizing the role of the body in the self. There's no bodily ego for a Stoic. That's a Freudian term. And I want to just bring it back as I close. I guess I have about 3 minutes or so. Let me just see how I can best wrap up. I'm sorry. I'll bring it back to Guantanamo. I'll end there. Timmerman has a wonderful remark about the feeling of self-betrayal and self-collusion, but I think it comes back in something in Guantanamo. So Timmerman is in mind when I'm thinking of something that came up in Guantanamo, and that is he has this picture of a man in prison in Argentina who is circumcised. He's Jewish, and he feels all eyes upon him, and his clipped prick is a source of terrible degradation, self-degradation, but it oughtn't to be. But he's reflecting the gaze of the torturer and of the interrogator, and the self-contempt is of absorbing or internalizing that gaze, of playing along, of colluding in a sense. And I think this came up for me when I thought about some, trying to find this page here, some moments of descriptions in Guantanamo. Just give me 1 sec. So one of the things that I heard talk of was being prevented from exercising control of bodily functions that are typically loci of bodily control. So from detainees just released from Guantanamo, some talked about being processed for 8 to 10 hours by U.S. troops at Bagram Airfield, base skimpily dressed in freezing cold weather, made to walk in circles with bare feet on sand mixed with shards of glass, denied use of toilets, urinating and defecating on themselves, and then shackled in stress positions for 8 to 10 hours, hooded en route to Guantanamo. And I think my sense here is that peeing or shitting on oneself because one's denied more decent forms of relief is a salient form of experiencing oneself as an agent, a doer without agency. One lets oneself do it. And so the case is not like that of a toddler who's not yet mastered bladder or sphincter control, nor like that of an infirm person who's lost it. This is actively doing it and of willfully controlling it up to a point, and then being made to do it on oneself. It's experiencing oneself as helpless in one's adult agency, and it's humiliating and regressive. There was use of a chair where victims would be force-fed, but then were apparently given diuretics and laxatives so that they shit and peed upon themselves in the chair. Again, the impression that one ought to be in control, one normally can be in control, but one isn't in control, and that one somehow is colluding in one's lack of self-control here. I'm going to end on that point, but I want to just suggest that the broadly Stoic view still leaves a torture victim, it seems to me, vulnerable to using oneself against oneself in the most degrading ways. And to see that as a kind of mastery just because it's active use of one's will is a perversion of what mastery is about. And so in this sense, I think Stoic armor isn't fully impervious. And perhaps not surprisingly, Stoicism's more durable lesson may be in averting the temptation to inflict torture rather than in learning in a bulletproof way how to endure it. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've probably given myself a few minutes.
Oh, yes, we have time for a few questions.
Yes.
Oh, that's okay.
And I'm also happy to
We do have
talk
some
about what I
que- we
did
have some
here.
questions.
Okay.
I was just looking at it in terms of the dynamical relationship between the torture at Guantanamo prisons and the tortured who are mostly obviously Muslim combatants, or so that Stoicism and Islamic principles are pretty alike in the sense that, well, one can see by the example of suicide bombing being illustrative of a misinterpretation of principles in Islam which are similar to Stoicism, for instance, disattachment with life in general, live in this world as a stranger, etc., etc. So I mean, considering that tortures at Guantanamo everyone is aware of that kind of conception of what Muslims in Guantanamo at least believe in terms of suicide bombing. The only way to get information out would seem torture, because any negotiable way of talking peacefully would just, how could that come about when the listeners do not really care? They're just attached to it.
Well, I can't speak generally, but I can speak at least in one case of a very moving interview. Georgetown student walked into my office. He's about 22. He was a freshman, so he was more advanced, and had spent 5 years as an interrogator, including at Abu Ghraib. He was in the cleaned up Abu Ghraib. And he, again, this is from the chapter I didn't read, he gave 3 cases of, I said, do you feel like you crossed the line ever? And this was an interrogator that had been trained in the manual, which uses harsh fear up and pride down, but had said never use it. But they had been chastened after Abu Ghraib, so he was well aware of what he wasn't supposed to do at this point. And he cited these 3 examples. One, he had a Shia and Sunni women that he was interrogating separately, and one of them had asked desperately for some freedom from the isolation, long periods of solitary confinement, and he arranged for recreation time for her, but he paired her This was a Shia. He paired her with a Sunni, knowing they would never speak and that it would be just as good as solitary confinement. He felt awful. Now, when I say he felt awful, he doesn't have necessarily the awful feeling of, there's a book out there called Harsh Fear Up or something like that. Tortured Tony is what I call the author. I can't think of his name. Tony Lingorini, I think his name is. But he feels terrible remorse. He felt like he violated something, that he exploited a trust. Second case he gives me, one of his detainees, and these are all Muslims, a man was known to have had some affairs. And he kept turning the screw on the guy, digging it in. He felt really badly about it. Again, because rapport building was what it was about, but pretense leads to authenticity, and there was a sense that he cared about the people that he was interrogating. Third case, which I found the most fascinating, young woman started to fall in love with him. So this interrogator's adorable, very, big eyes. I could see how he'd be a very good interrogator, easy to trust, easy to believe in a certain sense. And she started putting her hand on his leg. She asked for the New Testament. She wanted to learn about his tradition. He tried to diffuse the situation by bringing in an interpreter who would be a woman interpreter who would be present. He himself speaks Arabic and didn't need the interpreter. And the detainee started mocking the interpreter. Her Arabic is much worse than yours. I mean, he set up a triangle, a love triangle of sorts, and she got very, very angry. And now, I'm not sure if he felt he was squandering his chance for building the rapport, so it was a utility issue for him. I don't think that was it. He felt he had developed a rapport with this woman, and he had to do what interrogators do, exploit the rapport. And so here's a case, at least those are three cases that I had some inside familiarity with, that I don't think there's a stereotype of what the Muslim is doing that looks like the Stoic position. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. No, go right ahead. I just see your face. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I want to follow up on that and say, looking at this from the point of view of the military or whoever is organizing the interrogation, doesn't that suggest that the alliance building model, from the point of view of the people who want to extract information, can be a very easily, it can very easily fail, because if the alliance that's built up tips the balance for sympathy for the tortured victim, then no information is going to be...
Well, yeah, and in fact, this young interrogator says some of the toughened and hardened interrogators said, oh, you're victim of the Stockholm syndrome is what it's called, the Patty Hearst syndrome, where he starts feeling for her and she starts feeling, oh, I can protect him against that interrogator or interpreter who doesn't really speak Arabic well. And there might have been this. I suggest it because it's a complicated moral relationship. It's not clear-cut by any means. And in the cases that I'm interested in, again, happy to talk about it more afterwards, where it's not torture, but it's exploitative interrogation or coercive interrogation, there's still a lot of sense that an interrogator feels he's betraying himself because he can't or she can't get in and out of roles so quickly. There are roles, but we're one person who occupies multiple roles, and this person, whether or not it was because he was unseasoned and hadn't yet become cynical enough or whatever, but he also felt that when he first started his job, he was told, you leave your, wonderful quote I have, you leave your conscience behind and you follow the rules, as if Nuremberg never took place. No, that's not what I'm going to do, he said. So I take it he was a morally conscientious interrogator and would be willing to go so far, but the press of what he thought was right, even in these very complicated, exploitative relationships, kept him, I think, from torture or more or harsher techniques. I found it very, very fascinating and renewing in a certain way of my faith that there could be a kind of interrogation that maybe I would never be part of it, but others it's a profession that we should think very seriously about and understand. Oh,
Yes, sir.
What is the consensus among psychologists, etc., generally, in the practice of indefinite detention as a policy where it goes on 4, 5 years, and maybe there was coercive interrogation the first year or so, but yet the detention continues, and the person being held incommunicado can't know whether or not there would be that type of torture again, and still under control. So cannot move on with his life, his relationships, freedoms.
Oh, it's devastating. If you talk to attorneys who deal with people that have been in Guantanamo for 4 or 5 years, in case of one I've talked to, Joshua Colangelo Bryan, in charge of several Bahraini detainees who may now have been released, but he has this one detainee has tried to commit suicide 12 or 13 times. I raised the case specifically to a very high up official at the Pentagon who works for the Secretary of Health, who brought me to Guantanamo, and he just saw that, as often happens, suicide attempts are often viewed as shows of power. They're flashy things that might get attention and whatnot. But the trick here, and I think this is probably what you're getting to, psychiatrists are meant to be dealing with the mental health of detainees and addressing just that issue. But often they refer their professional expertise to what the interrogator needs or what the biscuits, the behavioral science consultation team, who are often the forensic psychologists, will do. So there's a lot of, a lot of lack of moral accountability and professional accountability. The hook has come. Get the hook out.
Okay, thank you both very much.